Most people think peace arrives after life finally settles down, as if calm were a reward for surviving enough storms. But what if peace was never waiting at the end of chaos? What if it was meant to be the thing that carries you through it? There are days when everything feels unsteady, when even your own thoughts seem to pull in opposite directions. You smile, you function, you keep going. Yet inside, something feels adrift and quietly exhausted. If that feeling is familiar, this story may feel less like a tale and more like a memory you didn't know you had. It begins with someone who believed stability belonged to other people, those with clearer paths, kinder histories, fewer invisible bruises, someone who had learned to read every shift in tone, every silence, every small disappointment as a warning sign, not because they were weak, but because they had been tossed by too many sudden waves to trust still water. And maybe, in quiet moments, you've wondered if you've been drifting longer than you meant to. Maybe you've asked yourself, gently and a little fearfully, whether it's still possible to feel grounded again. There is a small, unexpected secret at the heart of this story. Not a loud one, not the kind that promises to change everything overnight. More like a quiet realization that settles into the chest and loosens something that has been tight for years. It suggests that reclaiming your life may not require becoming someone new at all, only returning to a place within you that has been waiting, patient and steady, beneath the noise. So if you've been carrying storms that don't seem to belong to today, stay for a while. There's a gentle way back to solid ground, and it doesn't demand perfection or strength you don't have. It begins with noticing, with breathing, with allowing the waves to slow just enough to see beneath them. And somewhere in this story, you may recognize a quiet anchor you've been holding all along. Not to stop the ocean, only to remember that you don't have to drift forever. He had grown used to the feeling of drifting, as if life were a wide gray sea, and he a small boat with no anchor. Some mornings he woke already tired, pulled by tides he hadn't chosen and winds that never asked permission. Expectations tugged from one side, old regrets from the other, and he just held on, hoping the wood wouldn't split. There was a quiet panic in pretending to steer while knowing the current had the final say. Still, he kept scanning the horizon, wondering when the shaking inside him had first begun. On crowded streets he felt oddly transparent, like someone who had stepped out of his own life by mistake. People spoke, plans were made, days moved forward, yet he drifted a half step behind everything. A careless word from a stranger could tilt his whole mood, the way a wave tips a fragile hull. At night he replayed small embarrassments and old losses, as if they were storms that never quite passed. He sometimes pressed a hand to his chest, checking if the person he used to be was still in there somewhere. What frightened him most wasn't the chaos itself, but how easily he bent around it. He'd learned to survive by becoming whatever the moment required, smooth as water, shapeless as mist. But shapeless things, he was beginning to suspect, have nowhere to rest when the wind grows cold. Even his decisions felt borrowed, like clothes that never quite fit across the shoulders. And beneath it all lingered a soft, persistent worry that one day he might disappear entirely. Once, during a particularly restless afternoon, he found himself staring at a small model boat in a shop window. It had delicate sails and careful paintwork, but no anchor hung from its tiny side. Something about it made his throat tighten, though he couldn't have said why just then. He watched it rock slightly from the air of passing footsteps, steady, yet not steady at all. For a moment he wondered whether objects could feel lost too, or if that was a burden reserved for people. He stepped back onto the sidewalk, carrying a feeling he couldn't name, like a question following him home. Was it possible to feel solid again after so long at the mercy of invisible waves? Could someone who had drifted this far still learn where the ground was? The thought settled quietly, not loud enough to alarm him, just persistent enough to stay. And without realizing it, he began to look, not for direction yet, only for something that might hold. In the days that followed, he kept thinking about anchors, though he'd never cared much for boats before. It occurred to him, almost shyly, that maybe the sea wasn't the only thing responsible for his drifting. He had tied his sense of worth to every passing storm, letting each one decide who he was that day. Praise lifted him like a sudden tide. Criticism dropped him without warning. No wonder he felt seasick. He had mistaken the weather for his own heartbeat. One quiet morning he sat on the edge of his bed and tried something unusual. He did nothing at all. No phone, no rehearsing conversations, no predicting what might go wrong by noon. Just breathing, slow and a little awkward, as if he were learning a language his body already knew. For a brief moment, the waters inside him stilled. Not perfectly, but enough to notice. It surprised him how unfamiliar peace felt, like wearing a coat he'd forgotten he owned. He began to suspect that steadiness wasn't something granted by calm circumstances. After all, even on peaceful days he had found ways to worry, as if turbulence were a habit. Maybe stability grew from a quieter place, somewhere beneath the noise of opinions and memories. The idea didn't arrive with fanfare, more like a candle being lit in a dim room. He couldn't yet see the whole space, but at least there was a center now. That afternoon, when an old regret surfaced and tried to pull him under, he paused instead of spiraling. He placed a hand over his chest again, though this time not to check for damage. He simply stayed there for 3 breaths, feeling the rise and fall like a small tide he could trust. The regret didn't vanish, but it loosened, as if confused by his lack of panic. He almost laughed, softly, at how such a tiny pause could shift the weight of a memory. A thought settled in him then, gentle but firm. Perhaps peace wasn't a destination to reach someday. Perhaps it was more like an anchor already on board, waiting to be lowered. He didn't yet know how to drop it or where it would catch, only that the possibility existed. And once a possibility appears, it tends to linger like a door left slightly open. Not long after, someone would notice that door. Someone who had been standing on steady ground all along. Long before he noticed the door, his life had been a chain of sudden turns and unfinished chapters. Cities changed, friendships thinned, plans dissolved just when they began to feel real. He stopped unpacking fully wherever he lived, as if permanence might tempt fate. Even joy felt temporary, like sunlight between long stretches of cloud. So he learned to keep moving, not because he wanted to, but because standing still felt unsafe. Decisions exhausted him more than hard work ever had. Choosing a path meant risking another collapse, another moment of watching something solid turn to sand. He'd stare at simple options, stay or leave, speak or stay quiet, until the moment passed on its own. People mistook his hesitation for indifference, which stung more than he let on. Inside, he just wanted one choice that wouldn't unravel in his hands. At night, he sometimes imagined a quiet room somewhere, a place untouched by sudden endings. In that room, there was always a chair by a window and a sense that nothing urgent could enter. He didn't picture luxury or success, only rest, the kind that settles into the bones. Oddly, the image felt less like a fantasy and more like a memory he couldn't quite place. He wondered if everyone carried a hidden map to such a place, or if his had been misplaced. One evening, after a day of small disappointments that stacked into something heavier, he passed the shop again. The little boat was still there, rocking faintly in its glass-bound sea. This time he went inside, drawn by a tenderness he didn't try to explain. Up close, he noticed the careful details, the tiny ropes, the painted windows, the missing anchor. He held it gently, surprised by how something so light could echo the weight he carried. The shopkeeper said it had been part of a set, the anchor lost somewhere along the way. He nodded, as if that were the most ordinary thing in the world, and bought it without bargaining. Walking home, he cradled the boat in both hands, protective in a way that puzzled him. It felt less like a purchase and more like recognizing something that had been waiting. He didn't know yet why this fragile object mattered, only that he wasn't ready to let it go. He placed the small boat on the table by his window, where the light could reach it in the mornings. Without meaning to, he began checking on it the way one checks on a quiet guest. Sometimes he nudged the table slightly just to watch how easily the boat trembled. It swayed with the faintest movement, loyal to every disturbance in the room. He couldn't help thinking, well, that looks familiar. On restless nights, he would turn it slowly between his fingers, tracing the empty spot where an anchor should hang. The absence felt louder than any detail the craftsman had carefully painted. He imagined lowering it into dark water, imagined the relief of something finally catching below. Instead, the little vessel remained suspended in air, forever between drifting and stillness. He wondered how long something could float before forgetting what steadiness even felt like. One afternoon, after a sharp comment from a colleague lingered longer than it should have, he sat beside the boat. His chest was tight, thoughts rushing like wind through loose sails. On impulse, he cupped his hands around the tiny hull and took a slow breath, then another. The room quieted just a little, as if respecting the fragile ritual. For a moment, the storm inside him paused to watch what he was doing. He began carrying the boat from room to room, not out of anxiety, but something closer to care. If he felt pulled apart by a memory or a sudden wave of shame, he'd hold it and breathe again. It didn't fix anything outright. Life kept happening, after all. Yet he felt less scattered afterward, almost as if the object gathered the pieces of him that had been drifting too far apart. He caught himself apologizing to it once, then chuckled softly at the oddness of it all. Still, there were days when even the boat couldn't quiet the waters. He'd set it down and watch it rock from the tremor in his own hands. It struck him then that maybe steadiness wasn't something objects could give, only reflect. As this thought settled, he noticed someone across the street watching the same restless movement, with calm, curious eyes. And somehow he sensed that this stranger understood the language of drifting better than anyone he had met. The stranger turned out to be an older woman who tended the small plant stall across the street. He had seen her before, always unhurried, as if time moved differently around her. That afternoon she crossed over carrying a tray of seedlings, her steps steady despite the traffic. She glanced at the boat in his trembling hands and smiled, not with curiosity but recognition. "Stormy waters today?" she asked gently, as though commenting on the weather. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and nodded, a little embarrassed. Most people would have offered advice or brushed past the moment, but she simply waited. Her presence felt like a quiet harbor. No urgency, no need to explain everything at once. After a pause, she asked what he thought the boat was searching for. The question landed softly, yet it rippled through him in ways he couldn't name. He admitted he didn't know, only that it felt wrong for something so delicate to drift forever. She studied the empty place where the anchor should be, her eyes kind but precise. "Sometimes," she said, "we hold on to the waves because they're familiar." Then she looked at him, not unkindly, as if inviting him to notice what he himself was gripping. He shifted the boat in his palms, suddenly aware of how tightly he clutched it. She set one of the seedlings on the table and pressed the soil gently around its roots. "Peace isn't something you chase," she continued, brushing dirt from her fingertips. "It's something you carry, like ground beneath your feet, even when the wind picks up." He watched her hands, steady, patient, and felt the pace of his breathing begin to match. It occurred to him that she hadn't once tried to fix him, only to meet him where he was. Before returning to her stall, she tapped the side of the little boat with a fingernail. "Ask yourself what you're holding on to that keeps it from resting," she said quietly. Then she crossed the street again, leaving behind a faint scent of soil and something calmer. He stood there longer than necessary, the question echoing in the newly quiet room. For the first time, he wondered if the missing anchor had less to do with the boat than with him. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The next morning he found himself at the plant stall before he had fully decided to go. The woman greeted him as if she had expected this, handing him a warm cup of tea without asking. They stood in companionable silence, watching the slow choreography of the street waking up. Finally, he placed the small boat on the wooden counter between them. "I think I've been holding on to everything," he admitted, voice quieter than usual. She nodded, not surprised, and reached beneath the counter for a small iron paperweight shaped like an anchor. It was simple, a little worn, the kind of object no one notices until they need it. Setting it beside the boat, she asked him what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. Not what people expected, not what fear insisted on, just what remained when the noise faded. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing he had never asked himself so plainly. "Anchoring begins there," she said softly, tapping the paperweight so it made a dull, reassuring sound. "Choose what deserves your weight, and let the rest be waves passing under the hull." She pressed the anchor into his palm, its cool heaviness oddly comforting. "Peace doesn't stop the storm," she added, "but it keeps you from being carried off by it." He felt something settle inside him, like feet touching ground after a long time at sea. She guided him through a small demonstration, sliding the paperweight down a string tied to the boat. "Imagine lowering it," she murmured, her voice steady as the motion. He closed his eyes and pictured dark water, resistance, then the subtle catch on the unseen floor below. His shoulders dropped without permission, tension draining as if the image had weight of its own. When he opened his eyes, the world looked the same, yet not as overwhelming as before. "Whenever the waters rise," she said, returning the anchor to him, "lower this inside yourself." He nodded, though he suspected the object was only a reminder, not the source. Still, he slipped it into his pocket like something fragile and important. As he walked home, the city noise felt distant, unable to reach the quiet forming within. And he sensed, with a cautious kind of hope, that this was only the beginning of learning how to stand. In the days that followed, he began practicing in small, almost invisible ways. When a harsh email arrived, he didn't answer immediately, though his fingers twitched to react. Instead, he slipped a hand into his pocket, touching the little anchor as if greeting an old friend. 3 slow breaths later, the sharp edge of his anger softened into something manageable. The reply he eventually sent was shorter, kinder, and, to his surprise, felt more like him. Not every attempt worked so neatly, of course. There were moments when criticism still pierced straight through, when old shame surged like a sudden gale. Once, he snapped at someone he cared about and spent the evening pacing in quiet regret. But even then, he sat with the boat on his table and lowered the anchor in his mind again. The storm didn't vanish, yet it stopped growing, which felt like a quiet kind of progress. He noticed changes in ordinary situations first, the kind most people overlook. Standing in line, he no longer rehearsed worst-case scenarios or replayed awkward conversations. He simply felt his feet on the ground, the rise and fall of breath, the steady weight in his pocket. It was such a small shift that he almost missed its significance. Still, the world seemed less like a place he had to brace against and more like something he could stand within. The little boat on his table stopped trembling so often too, though nothing about the room had changed. He realized the tremor had mostly come from him, from hurried movements, restless pacing, tight hands. Now he passed by it with calmer steps, sometimes pausing to adjust its position with quiet care. It looked less like a symbol of drifting and more like something patiently waiting at harbor. He smiled at that, amused by how objects can mirror the heart when we finally slow down. One evening, a sudden disappointment arrived, the kind that once would have unraveled him for days. He felt the familiar pull, the urge to spiral into what-ifs and self-blame. But he sat down, pressed his palm to the table beside the boat, and breathed until the ground returned. The pain remained, honest and present, yet it no longer swept him away. And as he lifted his gaze, he wondered how this steadiness might hold when the waves grew larger still. The real test came on an ordinary afternoon that didn't warn him what it was about to become. A call arrived with news sharp enough to tilt the room, the kind that once would have sent him drifting for weeks. For a moment his vision blurred, old panic rushing in like a tide that remembered him well. He felt the familiar urge to react, to say something, anything, just to escape the feeling. Instead, he rested his hand on the table where the small boat waited, steady and quiet. He closed his eyes and imagined lowering the anchor again, slower this time, more deliberate. The noise inside him didn't vanish, but it stopped shouting, as if someone had dimmed the lights. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm he didn't fully recognize as his own. He asked thoughtful questions, listened without flinching, stayed present even when it hurt. After the call ended, he remained seated, surprised to find himself still intact. Later, he stepped outside and noticed the sky hadn't collapsed, the world still moving at its gentle pace. A neighbor greeted him with the usual small talk, unaware of the storm he had just navigated. He answered with a softness that felt less like effort and more like truth. It struck him that steadiness wasn't loud or dramatic. It simply allowed life to continue. He found himself breathing in deeply, as though rediscovering air after being underwater. Over time, others began to sense the shift without knowing its source. A friend confided in him during a difficult evening, drawn by the quiet way he listened. He didn't offer solutions, only presence, the kind he himself had once longed for. Strangely, their conversation calmed him too, as if steadiness could travel between people. He realized peace wasn't something you hoarded. It was something that widened when shared. That night, as he sat the little boat by the window, the city lights reflecting off its painted sides, he felt a gratitude that had no dramatic story attached to it, just the simple relief of not being carried away by every passing wave. He traced the place where the anchor would rest, no longer seeing absence but intention, and he wondered how many others were still drifting, unaware that something within them could hold fast. Some evenings he would sit by the window with the boat in his hands, watching the last light fade. It became a quiet ritual, not dramatic, just a gentle pause between one day and the next. He'd ask himself what had kept him steady that day: a memory, a value, a single kind word. Then he would imagine tying that feeling to the tiny anchor and lowering it carefully inside. The act took less than a minute, yet it left a calm that lingered long after. On difficult days, he chose something simpler, like the memory of laughter from years ago. He discovered that even small, almost forgotten moments could hold surprising weight. With eyes closed, he pictured that memory resting on the ocean floor, unmoved by surface waves. His breathing slowed naturally, as if the body understood before the mind did. When he opened his eyes, the room felt kinder, though nothing in it had changed. Once, after a sharp wave of loneliness, he whispered a single sentence into the quiet. "I am still here," he said, not as a declaration, but as a reminder. He tied those words to the anchor too, letting them sink until they felt solid. It was such a modest practice that he almost dismissed it, yet it steadied him all the same. He even smiled, thinking how strange it was that something so small could hold so much. He began suggesting the practice to a friend who often felt swept away by emotions. "Just pick one thing that feels true," he told her gently, "and lower it inside for a moment." She tried it during a stressful afternoon, pausing for 3 breaths behind her closed office door. Later she messaged him, surprised by how the panic had loosened its grip. He realized then that grounding wasn't a rare gift. It was a skill quietly waiting to be remembered. That night, as he set the boat down, he noticed how still it had become in the dim light. No trembling, no restless sway, just a quiet presence on the table. He felt a similar stillness settle in his chest, not heavy, not forced, simply there. For the first time, he sensed that the anchor was no longer only something he imagined lowering. It was becoming part of him, and that realization opened a silence deeper than words. One early morning, he carried the boat outside just as the horizon softened into pale gold. The air was cool, the kind that makes everything feel possible without saying why. He placed it on the ground beside him, noticing how strange it felt to see it resting on something solid. For so long it had lived on tables and windowsills, always slightly removed from the earth. Now it looked less like a lost vessel and more like something that had finally arrived somewhere. He realized then that reclaiming his life hadn't happened in one dramatic moment. It had unfolded through dozens of quiet choices to stop drifting and choose where to stand. Each breath, each pause, each time he lowered the anchor, had drawn an invisible line beneath him. Storms still existed, of course. The world hadn't signed a peace treaty overnight, but they no longer carried him off like an unclaimed piece of debris. As the sun lifted, a breeze stirred the grass without disturbing the boat at all. He smiled softly, remembering how even a passing footstep once made it tremble. There was a quiet strength now, not rigid, not defensive, simply rooted. He felt something similar inside himself, a steadiness that didn't need to prove anything. It was the kind of strength that leaves room for tenderness. People he passed that day seemed a little less threatening, a little more human. He noticed tired eyes, hurried voices, the subtle weight many carried without speaking of it. For a moment he wished he could hand each of them a small anchor of their own, not to fix their lives, just to remind them they didn't have to drift forever. The thought stayed with him, warm and bittersweet, like a promise without words. That evening he returned the boat to the window, facing the open horizon. It no longer symbolized what he had lost, but what he had learned to keep. A peaceful heart, he understood now, cannot be carried away by temporary storms. It bends, it listens, it waits, yet it remains. And as night settled in, he stood there quietly, rooted at last, still open to whatever seas lay ahead.